I think we have to be extremely cautious. Already, Afghans are the second largest refugee population in the world, and it's about to become much bigger as Afghans flood out from the country into Pakistan, and also, particularly concerning, into Iran, through Iran to Turkey, and then to Europe. We do have to be very cautious, and this is another implication of President Trump's terrible decision, which will have a big effect on this country, because we will admit refugees, whether we should or not. But we do have to be cautious about that. We have seen Afghan refugees in this country perpetrating some horrors against our people here.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. Cheers very much for joining us. If you enjoy this interview, please do consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell and supporting the channel via that link in the description. In today's discussion, I want to discuss all things Afghanistan, with the Taliban, of course, taking Afghanistan in lightning speed, what seems like breakneck speed to all of us sat here at home, with an unrepentant US president arguing that the US was never in Afghanistan for nation building, a UK parliament that's due to discuss this very issue with Downing Street recalling it, all as we witness the shocking scenes in which Afghan people cling on, grasp on to the side of planes, deciding that dicing with death is better than staying in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me to discuss all of this is the former British Army commander in Afghanistan and former chairman of COBRA, Colonel Richard Kemp. Hi Richard, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, very nice to be with you, Darren.
No, absolute pleasure to be with you. Richard, can I start by asking you just how it must feel for the families of loved ones whose lives were maybe sacrificed in Afghanistan, for those who lost limbs or suffer now at the hands of post-traumatic stress disorder, and all of the rest of it, all of those consequences of our intervention in Afghanistan, to now realise, to now feel that it's all been for nothing.
Well, of course, the families of those who were killed fighting in Afghanistan can never get over their horrific loss that they suffered. And those who were seriously wounded, thousands of amputees, many other life-changing wounds sustained in Afghanistan. These people will have that with them for their whole lives. Obviously, they will be intensely interested in the situation we've seen unfolding in Afghanistan. To those people who say that their lives were lost or they were maimed for nothing, I would say you're wrong. And I think actually to say that people were killed fighting in Afghanistan for the British government, for the British country, to say that they were killed for nothing is actually to dishonour their sacrifice that they made. I don't think it was for nothing. It was tragic, of course, it was terrible, but unfortunately wars are like that. And what they were doing, the reason we went into Afghanistan in the first place, of course, was to get rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who jointly had been responsible for the worst terrorist attack the world had ever seen, 9/11. And on that day, as you may recall, more British citizens were killed in the Twin Towers than have been killed in any other single terrorist attack anywhere in the world at any time. So, of course, we had to take part in the operation to remove the people that did that. And that succeeded very rapidly in 2001. And we stayed there. We stayed there for one reason and one reason alone. It wasn't to turn Afghanistan into Surrey. It wasn't to nation build. It wasn't to bring democracy to South Asia. What it was for was to fight to prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists from which they could launch attacks against the West. And those soldiers who lost their lives or were maimed in that fight helped to save the lives of many British citizens here and around the world who may well have died in terrorist attacks launched from Afghanistan. So their mission was a success. Their sacrifice was not in vain. But of course, the situation is now changed.
Well, quite. And I wonder how likely it is then that Al-Qaeda, ISIS and other terrorist groups will actually now be able to find a safe haven in Afghanistan. And perhaps that's why under the Taliban. People are really concerned that the lives that have been lost, the security implications for this country and others across the West are pretty serious now.
I think the situation just got considerably worse. The threat from international terrorism is now probably about to be higher than it's been at least since the height of Islamic State's power, when they controlled vast swathes of Syria and Iraq. The jihadists around the world have been celebrating Taliban's victory in Afghanistan, and there's no question it is a victory for the Taliban. They've been celebrating. It will have empowered them. It will have motivated them to renew and reinvigorate their jihad wherever they are in the world. So we're going to see an increased threat from those people. We're also going to see thousands, I believe, flooding into Afghanistan when the situation has settled slightly, to join Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, who are there in strength, to join them, to fight alongside them, to plan, to train, to prepare, to carry out attacks around the world. So collectively, this has led us to a worse situation probably than occurred immediately after 9/11, because now they know, and the Taliban know, and Al-Qaeda know, Islamic State know, there is virtually no chance of any further Western intervention in Afghanistan. Absolutely none.
I mean, just how similar then were the Trump and Biden plans for Afghanistan? Do you reckon Trump would have handled this any better? You know, Biden moved, for example, a lot of people have been reporting this, that Biden moved away the air capabilities, didn't he? And that reportedly had the Afghan military, they were basically at this point just saying, well, what are we meant to do here, lads, you know? And I'm wondering, would Trump have done the same? Do you think actually it's a fair characterization to say that Biden basically left the Afghan military completely helpless? Where are you at on that question?
Well, President Trump also announced and decided he was going to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. I believe that was a mistake. But it's no good Biden blaming Trump for his own decision. He claims, and he claimed in a speech he made recently, that he was pretty much bound by President Trump's prior decision. Well, he wasn't. He spent most of his presidency so far undoing much of what President Trump did, yet not this. Somehow this, now that it's gone so badly wrong, has to be laid at the door of President Trump. The reality, it's firmly at the door of President Biden. Now, I believe that it was wrong to withdraw forces from Afghanistan anyway. We hardly had any people there. There was a very small presence from the West, from NATO, including air support, a very small presence. But that presence, as we've seen, that presence managed to underpin the fighting efforts of the Afghan security forces, who have been fighting for many years alongside us and with us, and have sustained a total of 50,000 casualties in the last 7 years alone. And for President Biden to accuse them of not fighting for their country, I think is a disgrace from a US president. The reason that they collapsed in the last few days is exactly because of President Biden's decision. And the decision was not only was it the wrong decision, but it was executed in the worst possible way. It was done very quickly, far too quickly really, for an Afghan government that was actually in denial. And so the reason that they essentially melted away and gave up, and in some cases went over to the Taliban, was because they just saw the rug pulled out from under them. They depended so heavily on Western air support, logistic support, various other forms of support, and they knew that it was going to be, or they thought it was going to be impossible them to fight on without the West. But above all, I think it was morale, the morale factor of knowing that your final guarantor, the countries underpinning your very existence, had suddenly disappeared. And I think that was a major factor, not just in the Taliban, the Afghan security forces falling apart, but also in many governors in different provinces in the country suddenly realizing that without US support for Kabul, what was the point? It wasn't going to, the thing was going to fall apart. And they hastened that themselves by sometimes packing up and going home, in other cases by defecting to the Taliban.
In April, the Vice President Kamala Harris she basically praised Biden's courage in deciding to proceed with the Afghanistan withdrawal and even bragged about her key role in the decision-making process. So I'm not sure that we can have disagreements about the Trump plan being just as bad as this and, Trump advocating exactly what has happened today. But you cannot blame Trump squarely, can you? You can't lay the blame squarely at Trump's door.
No, I mean, he can't, because he is the president of the United States. As he said in a speech very recently, the buck stops with me. And then he went on to say how everyone else was to blame for his decision. So, no, it's no good blaming President Trump. It's no good blaming anybody else except for the president of the United States. And when he decided to withdraw his forces from Afghanistan, that meant all of NATO had to withdraw from Afghanistan. I gather the Defense Secretary claims to have attempted to put together a coalition of NATO members without the US. But of course, that was no more than a pipe dream, because Britain, having had its forces decimated over decades, does no longer have the capability to stand on its own feet in Afghanistan without America. And which other NATO member would have gone along with that? Clearly none.
Mm. Well, yeah, and that calls into question, I guess, just how much Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, they're going to be able to really, quite seriously, exploit this chaos, aren't they?
Well, one of President Trump's claims in justification of his withdrawal was that he could then refocus efforts against Russia and China. And clearly this withdrawal will undermine any of that, because Russia and China will look now at the West, and the US in particular, and will realize that America under President Biden is weaker than they even thought. So they can now carry out actions against us and against our spheres of influence without fear of significant intervention from the West. And when I criticize America like that, I'm really not criticizing the United States. I fought alongside American soldiers. I know America very well. I know many some outstanding politicians and leaders in America. It's the current administration in Washington that has brought this about, and it will weaken our position regarding Russia and China, and also it will make those countries that we had hoped, and President Biden had hoped, to entice into the Western sphere of influence, away from the authoritarians. It will make them think, why would we do it? It's, these are fair weather friends. When things get tough, they pull out. And they will see, I think, Russia and China, probably rightly actually, as more reliable allies for them, more reliable partners for them. So actually it's had a very, very significant strategic effect. And as for NATO, I think it's undermined NATO almost entirely. It's shown that NATO is only America, that the rest of NATO is sort of window dressing in a way, without America, NATO can actually do nothing. And that's what we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess then, has trigger-happy interventionism ever actually been proven to work, though? I mean, can we really not continue to target terrorism through a bombing and drone strike campaign that are backed up, by core intelligence and security work that have proven quite successful over the recent past? Do you really think that it's boots on the ground in 2021 that matter?
It was in Afghanistan, and we've seen that it was, because now Afghanistan is in the hands of jihadists. If you take, for example, the Pakistan situation, and incidentally, Pakistan is now in much graver danger of destabilization now that the Taliban's in charge in Afghanistan. They have their own insurgency there, which will be inspired by what happened in Afghanistan. And let's not forget what happens if that insurgency succeeds. It's a nuclear-armed country. But to take Pakistan and the successful drone attacks, wave after wave of drone attacks, mainly carried out by President Obama, which pretty much put Al-Qaeda out of business, not totally, but to a very large extent. Those attacks were only possible because of US presence and Western presence in Afghanistan. They could not have been launched without that. And therefore we can't, I don't believe either that we can significantly sustain a counter-terrorist campaign against Afghanistan without forces being present somewhere at hand. We're not in a position now, I don't think, where we can do everything remotely, as some people suggest. And, I think one of the key issues is intelligence. Intelligence in relation to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries in the region was made possible because of Western forces presence. The CIA had a huge footprint in Afghanistan, which was pretty effective. And as I say, succeeded in targeting or helping target terrorists in Pakistan. So I think, obviously, the counter-terrorist operations that take place without boots on the ground, some of them are successful and some are not. But I don't think we're at the stage now where we can say we will rely entirely on technology.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was one interview where, as someone, you can cut through the bollocks, if you don't mind the French, and you can have, I guess, first-hand experience of what life is like in Afghanistan. But there was one interview that I was really struck by recently.
Are really are peering into the abyss now. You mentioned scenes of local people clinging to aircraft as they were taking off. That is a sign of sheer desperation. And the reason for that desperation is they know what they face because they've seen it before, they've had it before. And it was the presence in Afghanistan for years before 2001, before the Taliban were kicked out. And what they're about to face now is, you mentioned women's rights. There will be no women's rights. Women will be effectively second-class, possibly third-class citizens in Afghanistan. They will not be allowed out of their homes without male guardians accompanying them. They will be forced to be covered from head to foot when they leave their homes. They will not be able to go to school, despite Taliban claims, lies to the contrary. Many of them will not be able to work, except in certain specified and authorized positions. People who transgress Sharia law will be executed. They will have their limbs or their arms and their feet cut off for certain offences. They will be imprisoned. These people, particularly in the cities now, will be living a life of nothing, sheer misery, I think. And as for the status of women, just really forget it. They're going to be in the worst possible situation. And we know this, that some people have kind of claimed, maybe hopefully, that the new Taliban, the Taliban around today, is different. They're not different. They're the same thing as they were before. They just know the value of public relations, which is why we've heard, placatory statements from some of the leadership and some of the spokesmen. But they're the same people, and we know that because we've seen the way they've operated throughout the time since they were thrown out of the country, and we've also seen the horrors they've perpetrated against people in the cities they've conquered just in the last few days. It's the same old Taliban. It's a dream to think they're going to be anything different.
Yeah, I mean, you had the absolutely laughable scene, I think, almost so laughable, but slightly grotesque as well, in my view, where you have Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, basically calling on the Taliban to respect human rights. And you just think, at least I do, right? What world are you living in, love? What reality are you living in? Because it's not the planet Earth that I'm sort of on right now. But I wonder then, you've been speaking about the plight of Afghan people. What do you think the UK's position has to be? Do we have a duty, I guess, to take in Afghan refugees, for example? There have been various ideas floated already, but my fear with this is that goodwill will actually risk being exploited, with people turning up in Britain, announcing they're from Afghanistan and they haven't got any papers, but actually they're economic migrants from elsewhere, like those currently trying to exploit our absolutely pathetic stance on border controls at the English Channel. I know it's a difficult conversation, but I'm just wondering what your view is on all of this.
I think we have to be extremely cautious. Already, Afghans are the second largest refugee population in the world, and it's about to become much bigger as Afghans flood out from the country into Pakistan, and also particularly concerning into Iran, through Iran to Turkey, and then to Europe. We do have to be very cautious, and this is another implication of President Trump's terrible decision, which will have a big effect on this country, because we will admit refugees, whether we should or not. But we do have to be cautious about that. We have seen Afghan refugees in this country perpetrating some horrors against our people here, as we have refugees from several other countries. One thing I would say, though, is that we should definitely allow in people who worked for the British forces in Afghanistan during their time, particularly interpreters, but not only interpreters. But I mention interpreters because they made our operations possible. Without those interpreters, we could not have operated in Afghanistan. Few British soldiers speak any of the local languages, and not that many Afghans speak English, so it would have been impossible. They through their language skills and also their local understanding and insight, they helped save many British soldiers' lives. They should come in, except for the ones, and there are some, who are identified as being a security threat to this country. Some interpreters were working for the Taliban while working for us. Others were pressured by the Taliban to work for them. So, with that caveat, I would say we should certainly allow in everybody who we can, who worked for the British during that time, because they are under particular threat. The Taliban have already killed many of them, and they're on the hunt for more.
I mean, just how bad is that movement of people going to become? You mentioned there the stat of the Afghans being the second biggest group that, is trying to get into countries like Britain. How bad do you think the crisis at Europe's border, for example, is going to become with the sheer flight of people leaving the Taliban regime now?
I think it will be significant. I think the greatest refugee problem that will occur will be in Pakistan. And they've already got a massive refugee population in Pakistan from Afghanistan. And that will increase without a doubt, as they're probably the primary place to go to, merely because of geography.
Yeah.
And that in itself will also increase instability in Pakistan with the dangers I mentioned before. I think we will certainly see a much greater refugee crisis on the borders of the EU, not necessarily immediately, because all these things take a lot of time, but there are established people smuggling routes and networks through Iran and into Turkey and on into the EU. It's been going on for many years, and it's a relatively efficient operation. So I think this will hit us before too long.
Now, to end, Richard, thank you very much for your time so far, but I wonder if we reflect finally on what needs to happen moving forward, because I think it's your view now there's no going back, right? It's your view that it's done now, so you can't send lads back in. But I'm wondering what we actually need to do, because you've mentioned, I think, the new global geopolitical consequences of this move, of all of this, of the US president's move and rhetoric and arguments. With you actually arguing, and I think this is your position, but forgive me if I misrepresent it, with you arguing that America's position in the world has actually been undermined as well, as America being that guardian of what liberal values and democracy around the world stage being undermined. And as far as Britain's concerned, I'm just wondering what you think Her Majesty's forces and intelligence services, security services here at home have to actually be focusing on moving forward. What is it that are going to be the key battlegrounds in the future, do you reckon? Because as you've said, China, Russia, Tehran, they must all be absolutely loving this. So what have we got to be wary about? And you mentioned NATO as being nothing more than mere window dressing, right? What have we got to start focusing on and getting serious about to actually keep Britain and the West safe?
Well, it isn't my position that we can't go back into Afghanistan.
Right.
It's my position we won't go back into Afghanistan.
I see.
Nothing is impossible in military terms, but it takes political will, and that's not going to happen in my view. Maybe there will be the odd airstrike against serious terrorist threats to us in Afghanistan. That might happen, probably from the US. But in terms of what we can do and what we should do. I mean, I think first of all, in relation to Afghanistan, people have been suggesting we should establish diplomatic relations with Afghanistan, and the Foreign Secretary was hinting at that very recently. I think that would be a big mistake. I do think that it would be the same as, let's say, we'll have diplomatic relations with the Islamic State when they controlled swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq. We obviously didn't do that, and we shouldn't do it with these, because these people are no different, really. They have obviously different philosophies and strategic ideas, but they are no different in their doctrine from the Islamic State, and they obtain power in the same way as the Islamic State did, pretty much. So I don't think we should be in a position where we are formalizing relations with, or recognizing them, giving them credibility, and therefore encouraging other jihadists to do the same thing. What I think we can do is we can apply a great deal of pressure, if we have the political will to do it, and we don't seem to have this sort of will, but pressure on Pakistan, on Iran, on China and on Russia to use their leverage for the good, to influence the Taliban for the good. All of those four countries I just mentioned supported, funded and armed the Taliban over many years. And they will now be cashing in their chips. They will have influence in that country. And we should pressure them to use that influence for the good. I doubt they will, but we can at least try to do so for the benefit of the Afghan people. In terms of the wider perspective that you asked about, counter-terrorism, we obviously do need to focus very heavily on that. We've got British forces, including my own regiment at the moment, deployed in Mali, helping to deal with an insurgency there, an Islamist insurgency. We've got British forces in various other countries and British intelligence assets, and the Americans have got even more so in countries around the world, trying in one way or another to counter jihadism. That should remain a very significant priority, and Afghanistan must be now a greater focus for that than it has been before. But in terms of maybe the greatest strategic threat, that comes from China. There's no doubt about it, and to a lesser extent from Russia. And therefore we should focus, as we seem to be to an extent, focus whatever we can on countering China. We've got the Queen Elizabeth II task group in the region now, and that's the right move to show solidarity among other things with our allies out there and with the Americans. But you know, those are our, as far as I'm concerned, are our strategic priorities at the moment. In turn, you asked about the weakening of the undermining of the West and NATO. I think, you know, some things like this are not permanent. They can be recovered, and they can be, you know, the previous prestige and influence and credibility of our countries can be got back. It took the Americans 15 years from the fall of Saigon in 1975 until the first Gulf War in 1991 to recover their credibility in this respect. So 15 years is a long time, and I don't think we're going to do this. We're not going to get back to a semblance of where we were for many, many years. But you know, as I say, it's a catastrophic blow to the West, but not a kind of total permanent defeat.
Yeah, well, no, thank you so much for that insight. I'm sure everyone will agree that it was absolutely fascinating. And actually to have someone talk about this stuff that knows what they're talking about, as opposed to blue ticks on Twitter waxing lyrical about anything and everything. So cheers very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Darren. It's been a pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Please do consider sharing the video as well if you did enjoy it, and I'll see yous next time. Cheers. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.